Saltify and Sapience Institute present The Double Standard Media Reactions to Zionist Terror by Jody Mcyntyre and Mohammad Hijab. Narrated by Ahmed Alauddin. Supervised by Sadiq Zaman. Media responses to the 1946 King David Hotel bombing. Background: Tom Segev, one of the Israeli new historians, who challenged traditional Zionist accounts of the birth and foundation of the Israeli political entity, described the King David Hotel bombing as, in its day, the equivalent of the Twin Towers. In 2006, on the 60th anniversary of the attack carried out by the militant Irgun group, which took 91 lives, 21 Brits, 41 Arabs, 17 Jews, 2 Armenians, 1 Russian, 1 Greek, and 1 Egyptian, Benjamin Netanyahu personally unveiled a plaque to commemorate the incident in Jerusalem. But to the consternation of the British government, there was no condemnation of its perpetrators, and the plaque claimed that various warning calls had been made before the bombing. As Segev notes, the perpetrators must have been seeking a terrorist attack without casualties. In an example of blame avoidance reminiscent of the discourse on Israeli terror attacks today, the plaque stated that, for some reason, the British did not evacuate the building and, as a result, 91 people were regrettably killed. Speaking at a conference before the plaque was unveiled, Netanyahu made his own distinction between terrorists and legitimate fighters, stating that only the former deliberately target civilians. In his analysis, Segev states that by this theory, a Palestinian organization kidnapping an Israeli soldier is perfectly legitimate, and the Israeli, for example, carpet bombing of a civilian area is a war crime, although he recognizes this is not what Netanyahu meant. Writing in Haaretz, journalist Bradley Burston commented that Israel has a terrorist problem it's unwilling to talk about. Although apparently targeted for housing the British colonial authorities' headquarters in Palestine, most of the victims of the King David Hotel bombing were civilians, and the attack leveled 6 floors of a wing of a hotel with 350 kilograms of explosive. Several Zionist historians, however, have questioned the designation of the hotel as a civilian target. Bruce Hoffman, for example, contends that the King David was the nerve centre of British rule, where fewer than a third of the Grand Hotel's rooms remained for civilian guests. That was an irresistible target to the Irgun. Menachem Begin, who would later twice become Israeli Prime Minister, was leader of the Irgun at the time and therefore responsible for the bombing. In his memoirs, Begin describes the King David Hotel as a veritable fortress in the heart of the city, that is Jerusalem. According to his account, not only did the Haganah give their blessing for the attack, but civilians were warned to evacuate the hotel several times before the bombing occurred. Begin therefore was not impressed at the denunciations that burst forth in the aftermath of the attack, particularly in the Jewish press, with the ha-mishmar and Haaretz specifically decried as bearers of bad news. Begin recalls the letter he received from Moshe Sneh, the Haganah's head of staff, instructing the Irgun to carry out the operation at the Chick, code name for King David Hotel, and at the house of your servant and Messiah, code name for the David Brothers building. Inform me of the date, preferably at the same time. Do not reveal the identity of the implementing body, either by announcing it explicitly or by hinting. The collaboration between the Irgun and the Haganah is a meaningful one, as it had been relatively rare during their militant activities. And although the Haganah and the Jewish Agency communicated statements condemning the Irgun early on, evidence of their involvement quickly came to light. As one commentator recently noted in Haaretz, the mainstream Jewish Agency and Haganah attempted to disassociate themselves from the operation, though it had in fact been carried out at their behest. On the morning of July 22, 1946, Jewish militants, disguised as Arab porters, entered the King David Hotel. After overwhelming hotel staff, they made their way underground and placed bombs near the supporting pillars of the basement. When they had successfully made their escape, the Irgun phoned the offices of the Palestine Post and conveyed the following message. I am speaking on behalf of the Hebrew underground. We have placed an explosive device in the hotel. Evacuate it at once. You have been warned. There has been much debate regarding the efficacy of these warnings and whether civilians had sufficient time to evacuate. But what we may note is a pattern of justification for bombing campaigns, which in recent Israeli aggressions have overwhelmingly targeted civilian infrastructure, a pattern that has continued right up until the present day. The stories of knocks on the roof in Gaza and humanitarian leaflets dropped from the sky have a history that stretched back far longer than the current escalation of aggression. In 1946, it was a hotel and the headquarters of the British colonial authorities in Palestine. Today it is hospitals, schools, bakeries, UN facilities, and ambulances that make up the Israeli bank of targets. In an early day motion tabled shortly after the 60th anniversary of the King David Hotel, British MPs expressed their condemnation of the Israeli celebration of the atrocity, which they noted remains the highest death toll for British subjects in a terrorist attack. Furthermore, they echoed the comments of the British ambassador to Israel at the time, who stated, "We do not think that it is right for an act of terrorism, which led to the loss of many lives, to be commemorated." But despite characterizing the civilian casualties an unfortunate mistake, the 2016 Haaretz report on the King David Hotel bombing states the pertinent point. The act of terror shocked the British and helped accelerate their decision to withdraw from Palestine 2 years later. The carpet bombing of the Gaza Strip and the rapid settlement expansion in Jerusalem and the West Bank we witness today is a modern example of creating facts on the ground. As Rashid Khalidi noted in 2010, this is a tactic which has been used by the Zionist movement for over a century in order to obtain control over more and more of Palestine. As we will see in primary source evidence from the British, Palestinian, and Jewish media, the King David Hotel bombing was universally denounced as an act of terror in 1946. The question today, then, is, as Israeli acts of terror persist, why did the denunciations come to an end? Responses of the British media. Analysis of the Manchester Guardian. The day after the King David Hotel bombing, the Manchester Guardian ran the headline, "Crisis in Palestine." Within the first paragraph, the attack is characterized as an example of Jewish terrorism. However, the perpetrators are also described as the Jewish resistance movement, with wholly different connotations. Remarkably, there is some attempt to convey the possible motivations of this movement, described as those desperate and daring men who believe that only by such means can the British government be forced to change its policy. To understand the Guardian's stance, it is significant to note that C.P. Scott, the ardently pro-Zionist editor of the paper, until his death in 1932, had played a major role in persuading the British government to issue their infamous Balfour Declaration, which declared their support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians. Here, the Guardian report devotes a sizable chunk of its coverage to sympathizing with the community that carried out the attack. Although recognizing the bombing as a brutal murder that will only bring further repression upon the Jews, the article notes that such repression will lead to a vicious cycle and only breed further terrorism. This stands in contrast to much of the reporting of Palestinian military attacks on Israeli targets in recent years, which are often, if not always, expected to be condemned universally and without qualification. One could argue that the article underlines a subtext of Zionist terrorism being rewarded with material achievements, for the attack is directly linked with the necessity of a political solution, for which the bombs which exploded so disastrously in the King David Hotel will stress the need for speed. Again, the Palestinians are never afforded such platitudes in the modern context, with any acts of resistance often completely stripped of their political context. Although, as we noted above, evidence suggests that the Irgun, widely viewed as extremists at the time, had collaborated with the supposedly moderate Haganah in planning the attack. Much of the Western reaction to the atrocity attempted to make a distinction between the two. The Guardian article adopts a proclamatory tone, saying that, to the British soldier in Palestine, yesterday's outrage was unforgivable, to be answered by ruthless measures, but the government must take a wider view. Again, it is a political solution rather than extreme violence or self-defense that is proposed as a response. Incredibly, considering that such a devastating attack had occurred just 24 hours previously, there is a tacit acceptance of the Jewish community taking pleasure at the atrocity, with The Guardian arguing that Britain would be deceiving ourselves if we did not realize that many humane and moderate Jews in Palestine will think first with pride of the men who struck this blow, and stating that what to us is a cruel and wanton murder is to them a brave and heroic action. Such language would never be countenanced in the context of a Palestinian operation against Israeli soldiers or military targets. But here we are exposed to an alternative perception of the premeditated bombing of a hotel. A brave and heroic action. The Guardian's second day of coverage was more emphatic in its language, describing the attack as yesterday's terrorist outrage and acts of terrorism. The focus here is on responsibility for the outrage. The statement of the Irgun, described in a sub-headline as the Jewish terrorists claim, is published in full with the British blamed for failing to evacuate hotel. We may recall the column space given to the Irgun, a proscribed terrorist organization at the time, when we later analyse how little heed is given to the statements or claims of Palestinian factions in the British media today. The Guardian characterises the Irgun as the underground Jewish terrorists' army, and in a section entitled Search for the Murderers, explains that the search continues in the old city where terrorists always go underground. The theme of underground terrorists will be very familiar to the modern reader. Unlike the previous day's report, the onus is now placed on the Jewish community to objugate the extremists within their ranks. This is a time when the Jewish agency and the community may prove that they mean what they say, that it has no interest, however slight, in these terrorists, and expresses its deepest horror at yesterday's murders. On July 25th, The Guardian continued with the theme of a Jewish threat in Palestine, running the headlines, Strength of Palestine Terrorists, Greater than Suspected, Irgun Getting Recruits from Illegal Immigrants, and Money and Arms Sent from Abroad. By now, the British government was suggesting a link between different Jewish organisations in planning the attack, and The Guardian reported on their evidence against Haganah and Jewish Agency, now describing the bombing as a planned sabotage. Regarding the Jewish groups directly responsible, The Guardian cites the British government's white paper, which describes the Stern Gang as between 200 and 300 dangerous fanatics fully cooperating with the Irgun Zawailumi, since both are equally committed to a policy of unrestrained extremism. However, the Haganah are also implicated in the report. The connection between Irgun and Haganah and the Stern Gang is equally difficult to write exactly. 3 times since last October, various outrages by the 3 organisations dovetailed in such quick succession that it was impossible not to suspect some collusion. The Guardian also presents reaction from the United States on the attack. In a section entitled Mr. Truman on the Outrage, the US President is quoted as saying, "Every responsible Jewish leader, I am sure, will join in condemning the wanton slaying of human beings." Again, there is a distinction made between responsible and terrorist elements of the Jewish community. More sensationally, a US congressman named Mr. Adolf Sabath is cited as claiming that Britain was under a fascist government and might have planted the explosives in Jerusalem. Analysis of the Daily Mail. Under the headline, Hotel GHQ, Death Roll May Be Over 90, the Daily Mail was unequivocal in its portrayal of the King David Hotel bomb outrage. Vivid imagery transports us to the scene of the crime, where, this morning, as cranes and bulldozers and hundreds of troops and Arab labourers still tear at the wreckage, it is feared that the death toll may exceed 90. The civilian toll of the atrocity is highlighted as we learn that the King David Hotel was crowded when the Jewish terrorists attacked. Neither is the identity of the perpetrators left to the imagination in the paper's description of the blowing up by Jewish terrorists of British Army GHQ. The next day, the main headline at the top of the front page read, Terrorists admit killing 124 in bombed hotel headquarters. A second headline describes the attack as a gang. As with The Guardian, the Irgun statement blaming the British occupation is cited, but quotation marks are used to disparage their claims to be a legitimate militant organisation. The warnings followed a confession by the Jewish terrorist army, Irgun Zavilumi, that its soldiers were responsible for the blowing up, now feared to have cost 124 lives. The Daily Mail goes further than The Guardian in presenting the Palestinian reaction to the attack, referring to a cable from the Palestine Arab Higher Committee to the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, which threatened that unless the British government acts promptly to eradicate terrorism and destruction of lives and property, we shall find ourselves forced to call on the Arab people to protect the lives of its sons and their interests with all the strength at their disposal. The Palestinian community here converge with the British in the characterization of the incidents as terrorism. The next day, under the headline, Palestine Army to Crush Terrorists, the Daily Mail directly links the King David Hotel with Britain's response, which is described as their biggest military operation in the history of Britain's 23-year-old Palestine Mandate, being planned tonight on the top floor of the bomb-blasted King David Hotel, which aimed to wipe out the Jewish terrorist organisation. The Daily Mail consistently frames the aftermath of the attack as a battle between Britain and Jewish militant groups. From the July 24th headline, Dempsey plans new Palestine roundup, to the July 25th revelation that it is now an open secret that the illegal arms found in ingenious caches at the Jewish settlement of Yeshek Magur were a small proportion of the arms illegally bought or stolen by various terrorist organizations. The most important British task in Palestine will be to unearth the remainder. A colonial tone is also noticeable in the Daily Mail's report, with Britain portrayed as the responsible party tasked with dealing with unruly elements. This includes the Haganah, who are described as an illegal Jewish military organization. Britain is presented as the voice of calm for, despite the King David outrage, the order to our 50,000 troops is tolerance. Nevertheless, the threat to those responsible for the attack is clear, with the Daily Mail stating that the plan to root out terrorism in Palestine awaits only the signal from London. A cabinet-level order, go. Analysis of the Daily Mirror. The evocation of British colonial supremacy is most prevalent in the Daily Mirror, with correspondent Barbara Broad stating in an eyewitness account, "I owe my life and the fact that I am able to write this story of the bloodiest terrorist outrage to the cool courage of the British military policemen." Broad's personal account accentuates the horror of the atrocity. She writes of how a black mushroom cloud of smoke and dust rolled away from our heads, and paints a graphic image of the survivors of the attack. Tumbling out of the building came a macabre, ghostly procession of British officers' wives and waitresses, streaming with blood, their hair and clothes covered in white dust. Too often in the modern discourse, Palestinian victims of Israeli terrorist attacks are glossed over as numbers, victims of a blameless crime. By contrast, the Mirror's report of the King David Hotel bombing draws a stark contrast between brave survivors, together breaking down a doorway in an effort to rescue trapped people, and morally reprehensible attackers, a jeep full of Jewish terrorists armed with Tommy guns. On July 24th, the Mirror directly refutes the assertions of the Irgun with their correspondent Barbara Broad, describing the claim that a telephone warning 27 minutes before the King David Hotel explosion was ignored by the British, which was made last night by the Irgun Zavailumi, Jewish terrorist army, as a gross untruth. Furthermore, a statement from Clement Attlee in the House of Commons is referenced, in which he describes the atrocity as this insane act of terrorism. On its third day of coverage, under the headline, Happy Event, Wire from London Began Jew Terror, the Mirror describes the King David Hotel as the first of the major Palestine acts of terrorism against Britain. The tone is sensationalist, conjuring images of secretive, violent Jewish organizations in Palestine in communication with colleagues abroad. We are told that the code message told terrorists in Jerusalem. Details of the attack and the white paper is described as featuring information on mystery men, codes, private armies fighting an underground war. Responses of the Palestinian media. Analysis of Filastin. On its front page, under the headline, Jewish terrorists commit a brutal crime that results in dozens of deaths, Filastin makes numerous references to the brutality of the incident. Within the subheadline alone, it is characterized as the heinous Jewish crime, 2 horrific explosions, and vile Jewish criminality. This tone continues in the main body of the article, which claims that the brutal, heinous, and insane crime will cost the Jews more than they think. This approach, as we have seen with the Daily Mirror, highlights the ethnic and religious background of the perpetrators and sensationalizes the Jewish threat. Palestinian newspaper al-Ittihad, on the other hand, took a different approach, announcing in a headline on the front page of their July 23rd edition that Zionist terror cannot be disentangled from the British occupation in any shape or form. Nowadays, as we will observe in our analysis of Arab media reports of the Jabalia Refugee Camp bombing of October 31st, 2023, the occupation is a widely used term amongst Palestinians to refer to the Israeli presence in Palestine, and Israeli acts of terror are denounced as crimes of the occupation, rather than examples of Jewish criminality. In their report on the King David Hotel bombing of 1947, al-Ittihad aims their ire at the British colonial authorities in Palestine, claiming that the British government is not capable of controlling the repression of the Zionist terror. Filastin, on the other hand, attempts to forge alliances with a British audience, offering condolences to the victims of yesterday's terrorist incident in Jerusalem. By highlighting the barbaric nature of the Jewish attacks and the problem with Jewish inhabitants of Palestine, Filastin attempts to make a distinction between the civilized Palestinian and the Jewish terrorist. Like the British press, the paper opens with a descriptive account of events and does not try to distort any of the essential facts, at least as it is compared with other newspaper sources. The paper does, however, emphasize statements emerging from Britain that appear to reflect an anti-Jewish line as a way of showing their own support for such statements. For example, they cite a Daily Star report that the Jewish terrorist incident that occurred in Jerusalem will cost the Jews more than any previous insane act. By July 24th, Filastin takes a more confrontational tone against Britain, and the Palestinian reaction to events are given more column space. The main headline states that the High Commission denounces the despicable Jewish crime and requests that deterrent measures be taken. And we learn of expression of denunciation and indignation as Arab Palestine responds harshly to the despicable crimes of the Jews. Furthermore, the paper conveys the community's condemnation and protest against the government's negligence in dealing with the incidents of Jewish terrorism in Palestine, as the victims of Jewish treachery cry. It could be that Filastin wished to afford Britain an opportunity to be tough with the perpetrators of the bombing, but subsequently viewed the British response as inadequate. In an article entitled "Weak and Servile Politicians," aimed at the British, the criticism begins. The crimes are evidence of weakness of the British powers when it comes to dealing with criminals who have no regard for law or authority. With these comments, the paper aims to delegitimize British authority in Palestine. Filastin continues with its reproval by saying, "We are not British, and so will not get involved in the private matters of the British people. But Britain sent such messages from our country, and not from their country." Here, the Palestinian nationalist spirit is exhibited, and a clear delineation is made between the Palestinians and the British colonial power. Next, international law is called upon as a frame of reference. Although we do not recognize the British protectorate, and we do not, it should be noted that Britain has the UN mandate to govern. Hereby lies an interesting paradox. Although Filastin does not accept the protectorate as legitimate, they nevertheless ask Britain to uphold its international responsibility and get a better grip on the escalating violence in Palestine by exercising its colonial mandate. The paper also launches a stream of invective against the United States, which is also viewed as an enemy, stating that, indeed, America, which Britain refers to on every major and minor issue concerning our case, is the country that supports the Jews and their followers in our country. Were it not for America's support for those Jews, the rats amongst the terrorists would not have had the audacity to commit what they did. The US and Britain's bias, Filastin suggests, is another reason that the latter is unsuitable as a mandatory authority in Palestine, asking, how can they be responsible for security in the country? In light of the many failed so-called peace initiatives over the last decades, it is important to note that from a Palestinian perspective, even from before the establishment of the Israeli political entity, the US was never seen as a fair broker. Analysis of al-Difa. Al-Difa was also both unequivocal in its condemnation of the awful Jewish terrorist incident at the King David Hotel and critical of Britain's position. In vivid, unsettling terms, we read that Jewish terror removed its mask yesterday, revealing one of the most horrific images one could imagine. It is further noted that, until now, this terrorism has mostly targeted infrastructure, but recent events show the development of targeting people. Al-Difa employed lengthy and detailed explanatory headlines such as, "A group of British engineers search for remaining living victims from those buried under the rubble and the remains of the dead to extract their corpses." In contrast with the confrontational and even threatening stance that Filastin had adopted against Britain in their edition of the same day, al-Difa chose to highlight the partnership between Britain and the Palestinians, referring to the excavation of the dead as a joint enterprise between British engineers and Arab workers. The paper attempts to also conduct a community service function by listing all of the names of the dead, found, and missing victims on the front page of the paper. In its reference to the bombing, the paper seeks assurances that the government will be tough in taking all legal steps to prevent an incident like this from ever reoccurring. Where the paper is forceful is in its references to the response of the wider Arab community. They print the Arab League's condemnation of the atrocity and placement of responsibility on Britain for political leverage and to demonstrate the existence of a collective Arab entity that could create complications for Britain. Like Filastin, the paper expands on what these complications might entail. For example, Azzam Pasha, the head of the Arab League at the time, is quoted as saying that these actions, i.e. the bombing, could inspire a violent reaction from the Arabs, which would ensure that the Palestinians get their rights. On July the 25th, al-Difa ran the headline, "British White Paper blames the Jewish Agency and confirms with undisputable proofs its, i.e. the Jewish Agency's, participation in the criminal acts." Highlighting the findings of the British report could have been aimed at portraying the Jewish agency as an enemy that both the Jews and Brits should join the Palestinians in opposing. And perhaps there was still hope in the British solution that would favour the Palestinians. This creates a narrative that is more anti-Zionist than anti-British, and aims to convince the British observers that they ought to be on the same wavelength. In this way, the paper attempts to characterise the Palestinian struggle, as the newspaper's name meaning defence would suggest, as a just, defensive fight against the Zionist enterprise that both its regular readers and Britain should rally to support. With the benefit of hindsight, one may observe that any hope in meaningful British support was misplaced. Although the British media was unanimous in refuting Jewish terrorist attacks that occurred in Mandatory Palestine, by the time the Israeli political entity had been established, such acts were placed beyond the scope of acceptable criticism. And so we find 75 years later that what was once terrorism is now self-defense. Responses of the Jewish media. Analysis of the Palestine Post. Like the British and Palestinian media, the Jewish press too characterized the King David Hotel bombing as an act of terror. In the Palestine Post, the July 23rd headline read, 41 dead, 53 injured, 52 missing in terrorist attack on Secretariat. It is significant to note that in 1929 it had been decided that the Palestine Post would be published in English in order to appeal to the wider international community. As well as condemning the noon hour outrage by gang, in its subheadline, the paper also attempts to reassure an impassioned British reader by informing them of the safety of John Shaw and other senior officers. The paper proceeds in this apologetic tone by providing a full list of British officers known to have survived and explaining that patrol wireless cars and armoured cars assisted in the hunt for suspect cars. The Palestine Post emphasises the witness testimony of a woman who had been warned about the blast, as can be seen when we read that at about 12:35, the Palestine Post was told, also by a woman, in English, that the government offices were about to be blown up, and that people had been warned to evacuate the building. In this, one will realise more of the fear and anxiety to the paper's tone. This is because it makes many supplementary points, one of which was that the woman spoke English. This is significant as it attempts to shift some of the blame to the British authorities and away from the Jewish community. On July 24th, British readers are again prioritised, with the main headline reading, Attlee tells Commons Britain will not be diverted by terrorism. However, Jewish ambitions in Palestine are still prioritised, with the main body of the article clarifying that what Attlee had said Britain would not be diverted from was a final and just settlement of the Palestine question. Again, Britain is painted as a paternal figure, settling a feud between two peoples, whereas in reality it was a colonial power acting. As Arthur Koestler famously said, as one nation promising another nation the land of a third nation. Stirring scenes are conjured of Jerusalem stilled and silent in a day of mourning, and, amid the rubble of a wrecked Secretariat wing, rescuers still working desperately. The report places a human face on victims of the bombing by describing, late in the evening, dramatic scenes of the rescue of Mr. D.C. Thompson, buried for 31 hours. In 1946, those under the rubble were afforded sympathy, but in 2023, the Palestinian victims of Israeli bombing campaigns in Gaza, struggling to dig their dead and wounded from beneath decimated buildings, remain anonymous. The diversity of the community in Jerusalem is highlighted to convey a common humanity in the face of terror. Over the radio, in all three languages, came a moving message from the Chief Secretary, expressing his grief, horror, and disgust. However, a pressing concern in the Palestine Post is the potential blowback of the atrocity for the Jewish community. Press in the United States stresses the possible effect of the outrage in throwing back the Jewish cause, and that, Some broadcasters have suggested that President Truman may discontinue his pressure for the immediate admission of 100,000 Jewish refugees to Palestine. And when Truman is quoted the next day on the wanton slaying of human beings, he says that such acts of terrorism will not advance the effort that is being made. The July 25th edition reports on the conclusions of the British government's white paper and the evidence of links between the Haganah and its associated Palmach force and the Irgun and Stern gang, who were described as 3 paramilitary organizations. Nevertheless, there are justifications offered for their actions which were intended as a warning to the British government of the consequences that would follow if the government did not comply with the wishes of the Jewish community in Palestine. As with the violent and threatening language employed by the Israeli political and military figures today, there was a clear link between the terrorism of these groups and their political aims. This is announced in stark terms when the Palestine Post announces that the Jewish Agency executive was not prepared to wait for a declaration of the government's policy, but decided to cause one serious incident in order to influence that policy. The use of violence as a political tool is also reflected in the broadcast of Kol Israel, in which they stated that the paralyzing of the railways all over the country serves as a warning to the government of the white paper. In a statement that is eerily similar to recent Israeli claims of victimhood, even when bombing refugee camps, Kol Israel had also claimed that the scope of the attack has proved that the Jews are capable of acting under the most difficult conditions. As with previous days, on July 25th, the Palestine Post continued to give detailed coverage of the recovery attempts as officers and soldiers joined in brave attempts to reach any entombed persons who might still be alive. Detailed, hour-by-hour timelines identify discoveries of further victims of the bombing. 2:35 a.m., the body of an unidentified soldier. 4:30, the body of Khalil Abdullah Yusuf, messenger. 6 o'clock, Captain McIntosh signals, succumbed in hospital. The impact on the reader is significant. One can almost imagine themselves at the site of the atrocity, where among the objects found were parts of a typewriter, half-typed sheets, a blood-stained piece of knitting wool, the needles still in it, and a sandwich near the body of an unidentified woman. As we see here, when sympathy is the goal, the detail on the victims of a terrorist attack is abundant, right down to the hours their bodies are discovered. On July 23rd, the Palestine Post had even estimated the financial cost of the damage to the hotel at 100,000 Palestinian pounds. In 2023, however, you will find no estimates of financial or human cost of Israeli bombs. On July 25th, the Palestine Post does briefly refer to Arab states' efforts to internationalize the question of Palestine by raising the issue at the United Nations. However, a quotation from a British Foreign Ministry spokesperson who states that Britain always welcomed a discussion before UNO of controversial subjects, belittles the significance of an indigenous struggle for statehood. As with the Balfour Declaration, where the Palestinians were relegated to existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, here their freedom is reduced to a controversial subject. Analysis of al-ha-mishmar. Al-ha-mishmar's headline also attempts to convey a unified condemnation of the atrocity, with Jerusalem shocked by the brutal attack, rather than only its Jewish, Palestinian or British residents. Al-ha-mishmar, which was a left-wing Jewish publication, was particularly vociferous in its rebuking of the bombing, perhaps shockingly to a modern reader. The very first sentence of their report denounces the attack as an act of Nazi-style brutality. There are several references to the diversity of the victims with the bombing, claiming the lives of many people, Jews, Arabs, and English. There is also an emphatic vituperation of the massive explosion, which is described as an act of sabotage and a brutal attack and the shedding of innocent blood, which aroused feelings of horror among the entire population. The civilian nature of the target is further emphasized when we are told that the explosion occurred when the offices were crowded, and only a few managed to leave. If we refer back to the definition of terrorism we cited earlier in this text, the King David Hotel bore all the hallmarks of a terrorist attack. The Irgun's goal was to drive the British out of Palestine, or in other words, to compel a government to do or to abstain from doing any act. They did so by causing death or serious bodily harm to civilians or non-combatants, and their actions were certainly designed to intimidate a population. Ha-mishmar went out of their way to foreground condemnation of the atrocity from within the Jewish community. On July 23rd, the day after the bombing, they reported that the Jewish agency strongly condemned the act, demanding the criminals be brought before an international court. Seeking to create a binary between a unified peaceful community and irrational and violent terrorists, they state that Jerusalem was shocked and horrified today by the destructive and criminal attack of the Irgun Zionist terrorist organization. The Irgun are further denounced as a reckless fascist gang that broke all restraint and is flooding the country with a wave of terror and blood. And the Tel Aviv Municipal Council are cited as expressing their deep pain and sorrow to the bereaved families in the wake of the despicable and premeditated attack. However, there is little mention of the reaction of the Palestinians, or how their aspirations may have been affected by the atrocity. Instead, by July 24th, it is a British official's concern at the potential impact on world sympathy for Zionism of the attack that makes the headline. In London, we are told, all morning papers harshly condemned the act. And in the House of Commons, a series of ministers expressing their outrage at the criminal act in Jerusalem. The statements of British MPs regarding the bombing at times seem incredulous. Independent Conservative MP Daniel Lipson is quoted as saying, "Vile and senseless disgraceful act that tarnishes the Jewish name has been unanimously condemned by all British Jews, including leaders of the Zionist movement." This contradicts the analysis previously observed in the Manchester Guardian, who stated that many humane and moderate Jews in Palestine would think first with pride of the men who struck this blow, and would view the attack as a brave and heroic action. Unbelievably, and despite the Irgun's well-documented admission of culpability, Labour MP Sidney Silverman, after castigating the mental derangement of this outburst, said to the Prime Minister, "Can I ask if there is reliable evidence that the perpetrators are indeed Jews?" Silverman went on to warn against the detention of every moderate Jewish leader without trial. Another Labour MP, John Hind, advised caution against creating a force similar to the Black and Tans, the British force that operated in Ireland during the rebellion and was notorious for its cruelties, or the Nazis. If we compare these reports to the present day, we find that British MPs were far more capable of advising their own government to show restraint in an arrest campaign against the Jewish community in Palestine in 1946, following a terrorist attack on their own headquarters, than they are now in advising a foreign government to show restraint in an indiscriminate bombing campaign against what former British Prime Minister David Cameron described as a prison camp. No one will forget Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, agreeing that the political entity of Israel had the right to cut off power and water to the Gaza Strip. Or Rishi Sunak, head of the Conservative Party, telling Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, "We want you to win." With Western governments totally unwilling to acknowledge Israeli carpet bombing as acts of terror, one cannot bear to imagine what such a victory entails. Analysis of Haaretz. As with the other Jewish publications we have analysed, Haaretz denounced significant damage and heavy killing in a horrific attack on government and military offices in Jerusalem, in which dozens of men and women perished. Interestingly, they are cautious in giving exact figures, stating that the number of casualties has not yet been determined, but it is presumed to exceed 50. As we will later discover in our analysis of reports of the Jabalia Refugee Camp bombing in the Jewish press, such caution has been discarded in recent years and replaced with an unquestioning acceptance of IDF statements, often with no attempt whatsoever to verify or corroborate their claims. In the case of the King David Hotel bombing, Haaretz instead relied on the eyewitness testimony of their own Jerusalem correspondent. He describes immediately after the bombing hearing a great outcry of the wounded and dying, as glass shards were thrown far away. In horrifying scenes, the reporter tells us how one person was thrown with such force that he hit the outer wall of the building across the street. He was completely crushed, and parts of his body were scattered on the sidewalk. In 2023, those who are accustomed to accessing social media will have witnessed videos and photographs from Palestine that they wish they never had. But in the Jewish media, the grisly human cost of high-tech Israeli military offences is often kept out of sight. In Haaretz's report of the 1946 King David Hotel bombing, we rely on written testimony of body parts of the victims were found on the sidewalks. One body was found on the roof of a nearby building, and the bodies of the dead were laid out on stretchers. But the effect remains chilling. We read of people losing hope as the rescuers despaired of saving a large number of men and women buried under the building's debris. And we read of those who persevered in their efforts as a police commander was bandaged at the site and continued his duty. On July 24th, alongside the utter condemnation of British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Haaretz includes leader of the opposition Anthony Eden's characterization of the heartless and unforgivable act. Updates on the rescue operation continue, with reports of the slight hope that grew due to the rescuers' success in saving 3 people from under the debris. Haaretz published a full list of victims' names: Palestinians, Jews, and Brits. In Haaretz's estimation, these were victims worth reporting. In the Palestine of today, however, such a courtesy is rarely afforded.